It was Christmas Eve, and heavy snow blanketed the countryside. Ethan boarded the last train heading to his hometown, a small, remote village. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that prickled at the back of your neck. The train, labeled Midnight Express, was old, its faded red paint and dimly flickering lights giving it an almost ghostly appearance. Ethan had been running late and barely caught the train as the doors hissed shut behind him. The conductor, a tall man with an unsettlingly pale complexion, punched his ticket without a word. His eyes never quite met Ethan's, and his thin smile felt wrong. The train was nearly empty. Ethan found a seat in the middle car, where only a handful of passengers sat scattered across the dimly lit cabin. As the train started moving, Ethan noticed something odd. The windows showed nothing but pitch black. No snow, no trees, no passing towns, just an endless void. He dismissed it as the snowstorm, but unease crawled over him. The hum of the train was too loud, as if it wanted to drown out any other sound. The passengers were an odd bunch. Across from him sat an elderly woman knitting something in dark red yarn. Her hands moved quickly, almost too quickly, and the pattern she was creating looked like symbols? Ethan shook his head. "Just tired," he muttered. A man in a tattered trench coat sat 2 seats down, muttering to himself. He kept glancing at Ethan with a strange intensity. Then came the scream. It echoed from the car behind him. Ethan shot up, as did the trench coat man. The elderly woman didn't react. Her knitting needles clicked on, unfazed. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked the trench coat man. He nodded, his face pale. "This train, it's not normal." Ethan ignored the cryptic comment and headed toward the rear car. As he passed through the connecting doors, the train seemed colder. The dim lights flickered and the hum grew louder. The rear car was empty, but a faint sound, a child crying, came from the bathroom. He knocked. "Hey, is someone in there?" No answer. The crying stopped abruptly. Ethan hesitated before opening the door. The small claustrophobic bathroom was empty, but something on the mirror caught his eye. A handprint, small, child-sized, and smeared in what looked like blood. Ethan hurried back to his seat, only to find the trench coat man gone. His seat was empty, but the elderly woman was still knitting. She looked up for the first time and smiled at him. Her teeth were sharp, too sharp. Ethan backed away, but she said nothing, her head tilting in a way that was almost animalistic. The train jolted violently. Ethan fell into the aisle as the lights flickered and dimmed further. The hum grew into a low, guttural growl, as if the train itself was alive. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Next stop, Eternal Rest." What kind of name was that? The train screeched to a halt. Outside the window, Ethan saw a dilapidated station in the middle of a dark forest. Snow fell heavily, but the trees were wrong, twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the night sky. The doors hissed open, and dark figures boarded. They weren't human. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as if controlled by strings. Ethan's heart raced as one of the figures sat beside him. It smelled of rotting wood and decay. The elderly woman stood up, her knitting now a completed red scarf. She draped it over one of the figures and whispered something into its ear. The figure turned to Ethan, its hollow eyes locking onto him. Panicking, Ethan ran towards the front of the train, desperate to find the conductor. Each car he passed through seemed different. One was filled with passengers dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces blank and pale. Another was empty, except for a single rocking chair creaking back and forth on its own. Finally, he burst into the conductor's cabin. The pale man turned to him, his face now skeletal. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "You weren't supposed to board." "What do you mean?" Ethan demanded. The conductor sighed, as if burdened by a heavy truth. "This train, it's for the dead, those who have unfinished business. But you're alive. A mistake was made." Before Ethan could respond, the train lurched violently. The conductor grabbed him. "You have one chance. When the next stop comes, run. Don't look back." The train screeched to a halt once more. This time the station was his hometown, bathed in eerie moonlight. Ethan bolted out of the train, his breath visible in the freezing air. As he turned back, the train's windows were filled with faces, ghostly passengers staring at him. Among them was the trench-coat man, mouthing, "Don't let them take you." The train disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ethan standing alone. He walked toward his house, shaken but relieved. But as he opened the door, his blood ran cold. On the living room table was the red scarf the elderly woman had been knitting, neatly folded with a note. "We'll be back." The hum of the Midnight Express echoed faintly in the distance. It was Christmas Eve, and Zoe was on her way to visit her grandparents in a snowy mountain town. The train was the only way to reach the remote village. With delays caused by the blizzard, the station was nearly empty when Zoe boarded the train, her suitcase in tow. The train was long, with most passengers crowded toward the front cars. Zoe, wanting some peace, decided to sit in the very last car. It was dimly lit, with a faint smell of old wood and metal. The seats were worn, and there was a strange chill in the air, colder than the rest of the train. The doors shut with a hiss, and the train began to move. As Zoe settled into her seat, she noticed she was alone. It was odd, but she relished the quiet. The hum of the train was soothing, and she pulled out her book to pass the time. About 30 minutes into the journey, the train entered a tunnel, plunging the car into near darkness. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Zoe thought she saw someone standing at the far end of the car, near the connecting door. It was just a silhouette, a tall figure, motionless. "Hello?" Zoe called out, but the figure didn't respond. When the train exited the tunnel and light returned, the figure was gone. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was a trick of the light. But the unease lingered. She decided to move to the next car, but when she tried the connecting door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Zoe returned to her seat and tried to distract herself. The train's rhythmic motion was calming, and she eventually dozed off. She awoke to the sound of faint whispering. It was coming from behind her, though she knew no one else was in the car. Turning her head slowly, she saw nothing. The car was empty. Then she spotted something strange. Her suitcase, which she'd placed on the luggage rack, was now on the floor, open. Her clothes were neatly folded inside, but there was an object that didn't belong to her. A small, old-fashioned wooden toy train. She stared at it, confused. Where did this come from? The train's lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as though they were all around her. Zoe clutched the toy train, her heart pounding. The temperature in the car dropped even further, and she could see her breath forming clouds in the air. Suddenly, the train jolted violently, throwing her to the floor. When she looked up, she saw frost forming on the windows, and strange symbols etched into the glass, symbols she couldn't understand. Then the shadows came. At first, they were faint, just flickers in the corners of her eyes. But soon dark shapes began to move through the car, their forms shifting and unnatural. One stopped right in front of her seat, looming over her. Panicking, Zoe scrambled to the other end of the car, pounding on the connecting door. "Help! Somebody help me!" But no one came. The shadows crept closer, their indistinct forms whispering in a language she didn't recognize. Just as one reached out toward her, the train slowed, screeching to a halt. The shadows vanished and the doors hissed open. Zoe stepped out into the snow, disoriented. But instead of a station, she found herself standing on an old rickety platform in the middle of a dense forest. The train had disappeared, leaving her alone. She noticed a sign barely visible in the snow, its letters faded. Merrick Station. She'd never heard of it before. As she tried to get her bearings, she heard the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. Turning, she saw another train approaching, but this one was different. It was an older model, blackened with soot and moving impossibly fast. The train screeched to a halt in front of her, and its doors opened. Inside, passengers sat silently, their faces pale and emotionless. A conductor stepped out, his uniform tattered and his eyes hollow. "This is your stop," he said in a raspy voice. "I'm not getting on that train," Zoe said, backing away. "You already did," the conductor replied, holding up her wooden toy train. As he did, the train's whistle blew again, deafeningly loud. Zoe stumbled backward, but the train car she'd come from suddenly reappeared behind her. The lights inside flickered, and she could see herself, her body, still sitting in the seat, clutching the toy train. "No," she whispered, realization dawning. "That's not possible." The conductor stepped closer. "You boarded the wrong train tonight, miss. The midnight line, it doesn't stop for the living." Panicking, Zoe turned and ran into the forest. The snow grew deeper, and the trees seemed to close in around her. Behind her, the train's whistle echoed, and she could hear the screech of its wheels as it began to follow her, moving impossibly through the forest. Just as the train was about to overtake her, Zoe tripped and fell. When she looked up, she was no longer in the forest. She was back in her seat on the train. But everything was different. The car was pristine, brightly lit, and filled with passengers chatting cheerfully. Had it all been a dream? A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ticket, please." She looked up to see the conductor, normal, friendly, and smiling. Relieved, Zoe handed him her ticket. As he punched it, his smile faded. He leaned closer and whispered, "You should have stayed off the last car." Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, and Zoe found herself back in the forest, standing alone as the ghostly train approached once more. This time, she had no choice but to board. Nathan, a college student, was traveling back home to spend Christmas with his family. It was a frigid Christmas Eve, and he had booked a ticket on the last train out of the city. The station was eerily quiet when he arrived, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The train rolled in with a low, mournful whistle, its black exterior glistening under the dim station lights. Nathan hesitated. The train looked older than expected, its windows fogged up, and its paint chipped. But his ticket matched the number on the side, so he boarded, shaking off a sense of unease. Inside, the train was unusually cold, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The seats were cushioned but worn, and only a few other passengers were scattered throughout the car. Nathan chose a window seat near the middle, noticing how quiet everyone was. No one spoke or even looked up as he passed. The train started moving with a jolt, and Nathan settled in, pulling out his phone. Oddly, there was no signal, not even for offline apps. He sighed and leaned back, staring out the window. But as the train picked up speed, he realized something strange. The outside world was pitch black. No snow-covered trees, no lights from nearby towns, just an endless void. Nathan tried to shake it off. Probably just the storm, he muttered. But then he noticed the other passengers. They weren't moving. One woman sat stiffly, with her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her hands clutching an old leather purse. A man in a suit stared straight ahead, unblinking. Nathan's heart raced as he realized they weren't breathing. He stood up, intending to move to another car, but a voice stopped him. "You shouldn't be here." Nathan whipped around to see a girl about his age sitting across the aisle. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a wool coat and a scarf that looked decades out of style. Her dark eyes were wide with fear. "This train isn't for you," she whispered. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. Before she could answer, the train plunged into a tunnel, and the lights flickered wildly. The flickering lights cast strange shadows across the car. Nathan squinted, his eyes adjusting to the strobe-like effect. That's when he saw them, figures moving between the seats. At first they seemed like passengers, but as the lights blinked he realized they weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their faces featureless except for hollow, dark pits where their eyes should have been. One of them stopped by the stiff woman with the purse and leaned in close, as if whispering something. The woman's head jerked upright, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Nathan turned to the girl across the aisle, but she was gone. Panicking, Nathan moved toward the front of the car. As he passed the other passengers, he realized they weren't just still, they were decayed. Their skin was gray and cracked, their eyes sunken. One man's head lolled to the side, revealing a gaping wound on his neck. Nathan reached the connecting door but found it locked. Behind him, the shadows were moving closer, their whispers growing louder. Desperate, he banged on the door. "Let me out!" Suddenly, a hand grabbed his arm. It was the girl. "This way," she said, pulling him toward the back of the car. They entered the last car, which was entirely empty except for a single suitcase sitting on the floor. The girl shut the door behind them, locking it. "You shouldn't be here," she repeated. "Why? What's going on?" Nathan demanded. "This train isn't going where you think it is," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the train to nowhere. It collects lost souls, those who died, but don't realize it yet." Nathan's blood ran cold. "I'm not dead." She looked at him sadly. "Then why did you get on this train?" He thought back. The station had been empty when he arrived. The train itself wasn't listed on the board. He'd just seen it pull in. And his ticket? He didn't remember buying it. The girl opened the suitcase, revealing a collection of personal items, photographs, trinkets, and a single newspaper clipping. Nathan picked it up, his hands shaking. The headline read, "Christmas Eve car crash claims life of college student." Below it was his picture. "No," he whispered, backing away. "This can't be real." The girl nodded. "You're in between. The train is taking you to the other side." Nathan refused to believe it. He ran to the back door of the car and tried to open it, but the train was moving too fast. Outside was still nothing but darkness. As he stood there, The girl approached him, her expression softening. "There's one way off this train," she said, "but you have to trust me." "What do I do?" he asked, desperation in his voice. She held out her hand. "Jump." Nathan stared at her, then at the door. The train screeched as if protesting. The shadows began pouring into the car, their whispers turning into guttural growls. With no time to think, Nathan took her hand and leapt into the void. Nathan woke up in a hospital bed, gasping for air. His parents were by his side, tears streaming down their faces. "You're alive?" his mother cried. A nurse explained that he had been in a coma after a near-fatal car accident. He had been found on Christmas Eve, unconscious but miraculously alive. As Nathan recovered, he couldn't shake the memory of the train or the girl who had saved him. Months later, he found an old photograph in a second-hand bookstore. It was a picture of a young woman in a wool coat and scarf, standing in front of a train. The caption read, "Eleanor Merrick, 1923, died saving passengers from a runaway train." Nathan stared at the photograph, his heart pounding. He knew he had met her on the train to nowhere.